Hi, welcome to this week's Soccer 101 lecture. What we're looking at this week is digital sociology, and I'll be doing it in 4 parts: on digital technology in the information age, on everyday life, algorithms and labour, on memes and GIFs, and thinking about platform capitalism. Just a quick piece of housekeeping. Remember that the reading this week isn't from the course textbook, it's actually from a different textbook on youth sociology, so make sure that you're reading the right chapter there. Okay, so I'm going to start with part 1 on digital technology in the information age. I suppose what we're doing in this week's topic is going into issues that we looked at in the week on culture and media, and looking at the effects of new media on digital technologies, what's often referred to as ICTs, informational communication technologies, and the way that these kind of computerized technologies, the rise of digital phones, the rise of importance of data in terms of how we're kind of tracked and sold and things like that, and how that's really central to how capitalism works today. We'll be going into some detail in terms of how sociology is starting to deal with those new developments. So some definitions, I suppose. Digital media technologies are computerized technologies that use a binary system of data coding, storage and transmission. So these technologies are both owned publicly and privately, as is the data sometimes. And they're used to produce stuff, like entertainment. They transmit, track and store information, and they really change our relationship with time and space. As some sociologists argue, it's fundamentally changed the way that we kind of think and be and feel in the world, to the point where it's got to the idea that there's some kind of separation between the IRL in real life and the online world. Making that distinction seems to be increasingly irrelevant because they're so co-constituted. A key person in sociology that's been writing about this for decades is Manuel Castells. And in the 90s, he wrote this huge trilogy of sociological studies called The Information Age of the Network Society. And Castells' key argument was that the rise of this importance of information, the rise of importance of data, the new technologies that had come to the fore from the 90s onwards, were fundamentally changing how capitalism functions. Essentially, the argument is that where previous versions of capitalism and surplus value were largely created on the production of things, in this new version of capitalism, the means of production are used to create and control information. It's not necessary that we've moved from one to the other. Obviously, still there's a lot of money to be made on the production and control of things, selling cars, oil, computers, phones, shoes, fashion, music, whatever. But there's this kind of new layer of the means of production, in a sense, that kind of becomes as important, information becomes as important as the production of stuff and the consumption of stuff. So Castells has his own version of structure and agency, what he calls the net and the self. The net being this kind of structural thing that we're immersed in, and the self is about our own identity. For Castells, he argued that there was going to be 3 key new forms of identity arise in this information age, and they're fairly politicized forms of identity. There's a legitimized identity, and this is people that kind of follow the rules, people that follow kind of ideology. There's a resistance to this, which is a reactionary kind of resistance, people that have been affected negatively by social changes that want to return to the past. And then there's project identities, which is more progressive, emancipatory ideas of politics, particularly around feminist ideas and around environmental politics. Castells also argued that this meant that corporations and companies had to change from that kind of Weber version of being bureaucracies to more what he called enterprises, being flexible, being able to move around quickly, and things like, Uber, Facebook, these kind of new platform capitalism companies are really good examples of that. Many of them don't actually sell products, they just provide services in that sense. Castells also had some interesting concepts to think about this. He argued that all this would happen in what he called the space of flows and would happen in timeless time. that our fundamental kind of connection to the very idea of time changes as we move into this 24/7 society where there's kind of no escape from the constant barrage of information that we receive. The space of flows for Castells is this kind of quasi-digital physical thing where like production happens, but very importantly, while we still need things like trucks to be carting things around, and we need cities to global cities as the likes of Saskia Sassen argued to make all this happen, the space of flows also now includes this kind of digital realm where a lot of the activity goes on at the click of a button, and rather than like people actually physically doing things. Broadly for Castells, he argues that politics becomes about communication power within networks of outrage and hope. And I think many of Castells' proclamations have kind of been borne out in the recent, last 5 or 6 or 10 years, particularly around the rise of Trump and fake news and the kind of rise of political debates on the internet. So Castells is a really important figure in considering these new social changes in sociology. In terms of what we're talking about here, in terms of this kind of digital realm, there's been some kind of almost epochs of the internet, the Web 1 to Web 2 to Web 3.0. Web 1 was a largely one-way thing where websites kind of created content and people consumed them. Back then, big physical cables, computers were these huge things that took up most of your desk. But websites themselves were mostly produced by someone making them, and people then kind of read them. There was chat rooms and stuff like that where stuff was going on again, but it wasn't until we moved into the kind of more Web 2.0 where websites became more two-way. Social networking comes along, mobile devices, so we're kind of connected to these things more and more. But again, the key change here is the websites become more a relation between the producers and consumers. The consumers themselves are active on them and create some of the content. Now we're moving towards Web 3.0, and this is kind of the way that kind of smart objects are kind of interconnected. They kind of talk to each other, sometimes without humans even being involved, and more things are connected to the internet in this way. So this is kind of idea here that the technology develops. These categories are a little bit lumpy in a way. They don't really understand all the changes that are going on. But we need to consider, I suppose, historically, the way these things change over time and the way they become more embedded in our day-to-day lives. Back when the kind of internet first started, and it seems like an eon ago, there was a lot of rhetoric around how freeing the internet was. That you could kind of be anonymous online, that you could, have various avatars of yourself and, be who you want, free of kind of social constraints. Anonymity there was really important. As things have developed, certainly anonymity is still a kind of key part of the way people behave online, but as we move into Web 3.0, these things track us much more, whether we like it or not. So the idea of like how much control we have over the way we engage with these things is a key thing that sociologists are interested in. There's a real ambivalence about the kind of positives and negatives of these new developments. And we'll look at some of those ideas throughout the rest of this lecture. So in this sense, sociology analyses of new digital cultures and digital relations, like I was talking about the media previously, isn't that interested, I suppose, in making proclamations about whether it's overall good or bad. It's kind of ambivalent, more interested in the various risks and affordances that these things provide, the way they offer the possibilities of social change, but also, and really importantly, the way these new developments seem to also reinforce, long-held gender, sexuality, class, ethnicity, race, all these kind of different inequalities. And there's also, in this sense, the way they kind of manifest new forms of public engagement. The gap and space between the public and private has been fundamentally challenged by digital cultures. So there's this kind of constant play-off between notions of progressive change, transparency and access, and the way that our relationships themselves become increasingly mediated through these things. So it's important to consider how these new social relationships and digital landscapes evolve, but also how they tend to reinforce traditional inequalities. And I'll go through some of that throughout this lecture. This is particularly the case with like new smart devices and the way that algorithms connect us to each other, but also therefore divide us as well. And the way they kind of reproduce history, because that's what data is, which means therefore data tends to be inherently biased towards more powerful groups. And again, that'll be coming up later in the course as well. So in terms of this 3.0 thing, smart devices have microprocessors embedded within them so they communicate wirelessly with other devices. They build relationships in this sense without human intervention sometimes. More and more these are becoming kind of sensor-based devices, and people kind of wear this stuff more and more. So this means that in this sense, humans themselves become part of the network. They're embedded in this. They become data entities in what's increasingly being called the Internet of Things. And what I find kind of comically ironic in a way is that many of the people that are kind of developing these things in Silicon Valley and places like that are having real kind of existential crisis about how this is going to evolve into the future. So we've all seen the kind of science fiction movies where, artificial intelligence or cyborgs or whatever come back and kind of wipe out humanity or whatever. But there are kind of real concerns about this happening. Will artificial intelligence in the future decide that humans are actually needed? So if you're interested in that, have a look around the kind of idea of Rocco's basilisk, which is a kind of philosophical debate about what artificial intelligence may do in the future when it comes to whether humans are needed or not. I mentioned a little bit about kind of the wearing of technology, and Donna Haraway's work is really interesting to think about this. Her conceptual developments in the mid-90s around, she argued that humans were increasingly becoming like cyborgs because we're increasingly coupled, humans and machines increasingly kind of coupled in that sense, in processes of production and consumption. So importantly here, like technology again isn't necessarily about something you have to plug in with electricity. Technology here is things like glasses. We've been wearing glasses for a century or two now to improve our eyesight. Technology in that sense can be a positive kind of emancipatory thing for people to use to make their lives better. But also on the other side of things, the way that technology becomes embedded in our day-to-day lives and even in our bodies, this can lead to other kind of forms of social problems. So we seem very willing to adapt and learn with technology to allow the machine to become part of us and us to be part of the machine. In essence, it's part of our socialization that we've been discussing in previous weeks. But once this becomes like, the norm, like a fish swimming in water, it's difficult for us to kind of maybe see some of the more negative consequences that this stuff can lead to. And much sociological research looks at things like health and body image issues around the rise of new technologies, and particularly around the use of technology to change the body. The same kind of thing is used towards the ideas of the way that mobile phones now seem to kind of attach us 24/7 to being able to shop and work. So again, if you're interested in this kind of stuff, there's a kind of there's a documentary you can look at there to look at that further. One of the areas that this has been important is in the way the technology is embedded in our lives is through health. And Deborah Lupton in Australia is a really prominent international sociologist around this area, and she calls this the quantified self. The kind of use of new technology to track our day-to-day lives, whether that's footsteps or calories or how much water you drink and all this kind of stuff. These technological affordances allow us to, in some ways, I suppose, try to be more healthy, try and lose weight, try and become stronger, try and become more productive. But this also speaks back to the work of Foucault in the sense that these things become, governing us through our own freedom as well. So again, the sociological analyses of things like tracking devices look at these kind of risks and affordances and the balance of those things. An example of this is particularly in pregnancy apps. Technologies have profoundly shaped the social perception of pregnancy. The ultrasound, but increasingly, things like apps reinforce the threats and the thrills of pregnancy, and a lot of this research tends to show how this kind of reinforces kind of heteronormative and gendered ideals. So the technologies in this sense can provide us with this idea of kind of safety, of scientific support, and being able to minimize risks in pregnancy. But the other side of things is it kind of reinforces a lot of things that aren't necessarily positive for women in the process of having a baby. Okay, I'll leave that there and come back for part 2 in a second.